What's up, everybody? Thanks for clicking this video. Thanks for tuning into my channel. My name is Simon Hill, Black American from Louisiana, coming to you live from Budapest, Hungary. Today is December 8th, 2025, about 1 a.m. where I'm at right now. And we are continuing our 17th book in our Book to React series. This is episode 6 of A History of Psychology from Antiquity to Modernity, written by Thomas Hardy Leahey. Reading this book for anybody who's interested in psychology, currently studying psychology, or just generally is interested in hearing me read a long textbook with my sexy voice. We are in chapter 2, where we are talking about the ancient Greeks and the origins of basically philosophy in Western civilization. And we are talking about Plato and his different theories and philosophical ideas. And we are now on the allegory of the cave. Jump into the comments if you have anything you want to say. I will be replying to all of them as we go. Without further ado, let's get into it. The allegory of the cave, the prison of culture. The third child of goodness in the Republic is the most famous and influential, the allegory of the cave. Imagine people imprisoned in a deep cave, chained in such a way that they can look only at the back wall of the cave. Behind them is a fire with a short wall between it and the prisoners. Bearers walk along a path behind the wall, holding above it statues of various objects, so that the objects cast shadows on the wall for the prisoners to see. For the prisoners, the shadows of artifacts would constitute their only reality. Imagine that one of them has been set free and is suddenly made to stand up, to turn his head and walk, and to look toward the firelight. Plato goes on to tell how hard it would be for the liberated prisoner to give up his familiar reality for the greater reality of the fire and the statues. Harder still, he must be dragged forcibly through pains and distress. Is the ascent past the fires out the mouth of the cave and into the world itself and the sun that illuminates it. Ultimately, he would feel joy in his new situation and look with disdain on the life he previously led, with its traditionally Greek pursuit of honor and glory. Finally, Plato asks that we imagine the prisoner return to his old spot in the cave, not seeing well in the dark, yet knowing the truth. Wouldn't he make a fool of himself? Wouldn't they, the other cave dwellers, say that he'd come back from his upward journey with his eyes ruined and that it wasn't even worth trying to go up there? And wouldn't they, if they could, grab hold of anyone who tried to set them free and take them up there and kill him? All right. All right. Shout out to Nelson. He says, this late, all hail the grind. Ain't no grind, man. We're trying to expand the mind. We're just growing the mind. Look out for a new movie review coming soon. And yes, we will be doing some call-in shows sometime this week. I'm studying a lot for my exams, and I'm also working a lot too, trying to get paid. Anyway, Plato offered the cave as an allegory of the human condition. Each soul is imprisoned in an imperfect fleshy body, forced to look through imperfect physical eyes at imperfect copies of the forms, illuminated by the sun. Moreover, the soul is victim to the conventional beliefs of the society in which it lives. As the freed prisoners turns his head around from the shadows to reality, Plato asks us to turn our souls around from the ordinary world and our cultural presuppositions and undertake the difficult journey to the better world of the forms, the true reality of which objects are but shadows. The allegory of the cave is at once optimistic and pessimistic. The optimism lies in the promise that with effort we can be liberated from ignorance and illusion. The cave is culture, the web of conventional beliefs that Socrates and Lunchus brought into question. Through philosophy and right education, however, we can escape from the cave of opinion and appearances to the realm of knowledge and reality. We may know the truth, and it shall make us free. The pessimism lies in the difficulty and dangers of the path upward. It is not, Plato says, for everyone. It is only for an elite few whose character can bear its burdens. Most people do not want to be free, he suggests, and will greet their would-be liberators with jeers and even death. The story is also an allegory of Socrates' life. He once was a political animal and a brave soldier, but obtained a vision of truth that he tried to share with the world to his own cost. Centuries later, when the Republic became known to Christians, the allegory of the cave in Socrates' life made powerful impressions, striking deep resonances with the story of Christ, who assumed human form, taught the truth, and was executed by disbelieving men. Going to the comments, Nelson says, what's the next movie? Asking so I can watch in advance. Freud was on crack. Okay. The movie is The Long Walk, the new Stephen King film, directed by Christopher Lawrence. It's not hard to find. You can find it all over the internet. It's the 2025 film, The Long Walk. It should be coming out in about a few hours or so. The ladder of love, being drawn to the good. The fourth metaphor for the forms, the ladder of love, in the Symposium, describes the love of beauty, which Plato once said was the easiest path from the world to the forms. Through the female character Diotima, Plato describes an upward ascent from profane physical love to sacred love of the form of beauty itself. The introduction of Diotima into the Symposium is quite significant. Athenian men deprecated women. They were not citizens. They could not be warriors because they were physically weak. Athenian men looked upon women only as vehicles of procreation. They treated women much as Wahhabi Islam does. I hate how this writer just randomly throws out Islamophobic references. There was a way to describe the misogyny of ancient Greece without talking about how wicked and evil the Muslims are. And it would make sense if this was the only reference, but every single time he can talk about something negative, he has to point out, yeah, the Muslims are so bad. Like what? At this time in history, the Muslims didn't even exist. So why not compare how the Athenians or the Spartans or the Greeks in general were misogynistic to other people of their own time? It's like he has to sort of like say, hey, we used to be so bad, but now look at us. We're so elevated and sophisticated. Meanwhile, these other people practice a type of misogyny that my ancestors or my intellectual ancestors practiced millennia ago. Anyway. All right. So anyway, Nelson Moreno says he saw The Long Walk and it was okay. That's generally the impression that we give, but we go deeper into the story and it actually causes some very interesting conversations. Moving on. Anyway, the ancient Greeks treated women much as Wahhabi Islam does. They were to remain at home, out of sight of men, slaves out to do shopping and other chores. The only women allowed into Symposium were the most expensive prostitutes, the hetera. Yet at the same time, if politics was the province of men, religion was the province of women. Thus, Plato suggests that Diotima's teachings on love to Socrates and through him to his audience at the Symposium are a divine revelation rather than a philosophical argument. The first rung of the ladder is sexual love, but it must be steered in the right direction by a philosophical guide, as Diotima was said to have led Socrates. The student begins while still young by going to beautiful bodies, and first, if his guide guides rightly, to love one single body. Understanding Plato's formulation of this first step to truth requires understanding the conception and practice of male homoerotic love in Athens and much of the classical world. Greek citizens, all male, spent most of their time together, shunning home life. In this atmosphere, a well-defined homoerotic culture grew up, as Greeks did not categorize people as heterosexual or homosexual. Established citizens would take as lovers beautiful youths who had just entered puberty, but whose beards were not grown and so were not yet citizens themselves. The older man became a mentor and teacher to the youth, and sometimes the relationship would last throughout life. The Greeks regarded the erotic connection between teacher and student as essential to the education of youth and as part of the initiation of a young man into the warrior band, especially at Sparta. As the Greeks sequestered their women, homosexual relationships also formed among women, again especially at Sparta, whose men were rarely at home, living in their barracks or away at war. Among both men and women, homosexual relationships provided the companionship and emotional intimacy later linked to marriage in Hellenistic and Christian cultures. The exact nature of these relationships, especially the kind of physical intimacy that took place, remains controversial. In the highest theory of the day, the relationships were, as our saying goes, platonic, although there is no question that sexual activity did in fact occur. Socrates, although susceptible to male beauty, condemned any sexual liaisons with his students, saying it was always bad for the young men. The symposium ends with the story of Alcibiades, the most beautiful youth of his day and a student of Socrates, recounting the abject failure of his aggressive attempts to seduce Socrates. Socrates' resistance to Alcibiades' attempted seduction shows that while lust is the first step towards knowledge of the beautiful, it must be abandoned for the love of wisdom, philosophy. So let us all remember the roots of Western civilization are based on slavery and homoerotic relationships between men who subjugated their women to the point that the women ended up becoming lesbians. Let's continue here. In the conception of love in the Symposium and most of Plato's works, his last, The Laws, in which Socrates is absent, condemns homosexuality outright. Love of women was inferior to homosexual love. I repeat, in Plato's mind, love of women was inferior to homosexual love. Love of women leads to procreation of children, seeking immortality through merely physical offspring doomed to die. Greek men tended to fear women as sexual temptresses who pulled their eyes from better things such as politics, war, or for Socrates and Plato, philosophy and the pursuit of the good. Such fear of sexuality passed over into certain strands of Christian and Islamic thought, where physical pleasure was regarded as distracting men from knowing and worshiping God. Better than physical procreation, being pregnant with respect to the body, Plato thought was being pregnant in respect to one's soul, seeking immortality in the soul itself, and through teaching students and having intellectual rather than physical heirs. Having learned to love one beautiful body, the student next learns to recognize that the beauty on anybody, whatever, is akin to that on any other body. Realizing this, he is constituted a lover of all beautiful bodies and relaxes this vehemence for one, looking down on it and believing it of small importance. After this, he must come to believe that beauty in souls is much more to be valued than in the body. With Socrates, we move beyond the love of the body to the love of the soul, and such a man will teach ugly youths of good soul. Socrates was famously ugly, believing bodily beauty a small thing. Now the teacher introduces the student to other kinds of beauty in practices such as music and art, and in studies such as mathematics and philosophy. For Plato, when properly guided, Eros goes beyond the panting of physical love to a union with beauty itself in the realm of the forms, where truth is beauty and beauty is truth. He who has been educated in the thing of love up to this point, beholding beautiful things rightly and in due order, will then suddenly, in an instant, proceeding at that point to the end of things of love, see something marvelous, beautiful in nature. It is that, Socrates, for the sake of which in fact all his previous labors existed. But when someone ascending from things here through the right love of boys begins to clearly see that the beautiful, he would pretty well touch the end. For this is the right way to proceed in matters of love, or to be led by another, beginning from these beautiful things here, to ascend ever upward for the sake of that. The beautiful, as though using the steps of a ladder, from 1 to 2, and from 2 to all beautiful bodies, and from beautiful bodies to beautiful practices, and from practices to beautiful studies. And from studies one arrives at the end at that study, which is nothing other than the study of that, the beautiful itself. And one knows in the end, by itself, what it is to be beautiful. It is there, if anywhere, dear Socrates, the human life is to be lived in contemplating the beautiful itself. In the Republic, the ladder of love is elaborated into the lengthy and painstaking form of education laid down for the Republic's philosopher leaders, the guardians. As children, they received the same moralizing form of education as all citizens. Plato proposes carefully censoring literature, including Homer, whose Iliad and Odyssey were the Greeks' Bible, replacing it with tales crafted by teachers to build proper character. Music, too, is carefully regulated so that only what is perfect and pleasant is heard. Athletics train the body as literature, and music train the soul. Only the elite of the noblest souls, including women, a concept that initially shocked Plato's audience, however, are selected for higher academic education. Through philosophy, the guardian elite is led out of the cave of opinion to knowledge of the forms, but they are obligated to return to the best cave going, Plato's Republic, and rule disinterestedly out of their inspired wisdom. Only they know what is best for all the citizens of the Republic. The Spartan equals inspired Plato's guardian class, although the guardians were not to be warriors. The Greek tension between what is owed to the polis and what is owed to the family, oikos, was solved by Plato along Spartan lines. He extended the idea of Spartan barracks life by forbidding marriage, though not sexual union, among the guardians. They thus had no oikos to draw their attention away from choosing what was best for their republic. A form of testing was implicit in Plato's Republic, because offspring of the lower classes might enter the guardian class if they were worthy, and offspring of guardians might be demoted if found unworthy. We have seen that, at Sparta, a government official, not an infant's parents, decided if a child was to be accepted as a Spartan or exposed to death, and Plato incorporated this practice into his ideal republic. Learning as remembering, knowledge is within us. In some other dialogues, a different path to the forms is described that resembles Socrates' midwifery. From his Pythagorean education and from the Greek religion of Orphism, as well as other religious influences, especially Hinduism, entering Greece from the east, Plato adopted the idea of reincarnation. For example, in the Phaedrus, Plato works out a detailed scheme by which souls go through a cycle of reincarnations. Souls are born in heaven and thus see the forms before their first incarnation in the pollution of the walking sepulchre we call a body. The future fate of a soul depends on how virtuous a life it led on earth. At death, souls are brought to judgment. The wicked go to expiate their sins in places of judgment beneath the earth, and may come back as beasts. The virtuous, especially those who had been philosophers, who on the third straight incarnation as philosophers escape the wheel of rebirth, will ascend to the highest reaches of the heavens, and in the train of the gods see the forms again. The less virtuous ascend less high in heaven and are more quickly reincarnated as lesser humans, such as financiers, third best, or farmers, seventh. Thus, every human soul, by its very nature, has beheld true being. In the sepulchre of the body, however, the beatific vision of the forms is forgotten, more in bad people than in good. Knowledge of the forms may be regained, however, as contemplation of beautiful things leads us to knowledge of beauty itself, because all beautiful things resemble beauty. So all cats resemble the form of the cats, gerbils the form of the gerbil, just acts the form of justice, and so on for all universal concept terms. Because of the resemblance of things to the forms that are within us, we can collect out of the multiplicities of sense impressions a unity arrived at by a process of reason. Such a process is simply the recollection of things which our soul once perceived when it took its journey with a god, gazing upwards towards what is truly real. Plato appealed to reincarnation to explain how Socrates could act as a moral midwife, giving birth to knowledge of virtue, without explicitly teaching it. Knowledge of virtue, like all knowledge, is latent in the soul, hidden by the body and conventional belief, awaiting the right stimuli to be recollected. Perhaps the oldest enduring controversy in the history of psychology is the debate between nativism and empiricism, nature and nurture. Plato is the first great exponent of nativism, holding that our character and knowledge are innate. being carried by the soul from its vision of the forms and its lives in previous incarnations. Learning is a process of recollecting to consciousness what we already knew, but of which we have become ignorant. Motivation. Why do we act as we do? As a moral philosopher, Plato addressed questions about human motivation. Although he accepted the Greek beliefs that happiness, eudaimonia, and virtue are intimately connected and that all people naturally seek happiness, he did not accept his teacher's view that wrong deeds are the result of ignorance alone. In the Republic and Phaedrus, Plato proposed a different psychology of human motives and human action. Plato divided the citizens of the Republic into three classes. By virtue of innate greatness of soul and the academic education it merits, the elite guardians constitute the ruling class. Next in character are the auxiliaries, who aid the guardians by acting as soldiers, magistrates, and other functionaries of the Republic. The mass of the citizens makes up the least inherently virtuous productive class. In a way reminiscent of Homeric mini-soul psychology, Plato postulates three forms of soul present in every human being that parallel the three classes of citizens. Class membership is determined by which soul rules each citizen. The highest soul, and the only immortal one, is the rational soul, located in the head, because this soul, being perfect, must be round and thus be located in the roundest and highest part of the body. The rational soul rules each guardian, who are thus the most fit to rule the Republic. The second best soul is the spiritual soul, located in the chest and dominant in the auxiliaries. The spiritual soul represents the old Homeric virtues, being motivated by glory and fame. Because of its quest for noble things like glory and the immortality of fame, and because it can feel shame and guilt, the spirited soul is superior to the third soul, the desiring soul, located in the belly and genitals. The desiring soul is a disparate grab bag of irrational wants, bodily desires, such as hunger or lust, are appetite of the desiring soul shared with animals, but desire for money is also located there. It may be best to think of the desiring soul as the pursuit of self-interest, which the Greeks always deprecated. It dominates in the productive classes, who are described as unfit to rule precisely because they seek their own interests, not the general interests of the polis. The guardians should rule because their elite, educated reason and virtuous character places them beyond self-interest. As in the doctrine of reincarnation, Plato's depiction of the ideal society and the mapping of its classes onto aspects of personality were probably influenced by ancient Indian theology. The Hindu Rig Veda divided society into four castes: the Brahmins, theologians and ultimate rulers; the Kshatriya, warriors and day-to-day rulers; the Vaisya, professionals and artisans; and the Sudra, laborers. In a way, we've learned a characteristic of Greek thought. Plato folds the last two Hindu castes, who work rather than think or rule, into a single productive class. Like Plato, the Hindus identified each class with an aspect of the person: soul, intellect, mind, and body, and with a corresponding part of the body: head, heart, loins, and feet. In the Phaedrus, the three forms of soul are described in metaphor, later alluded to by a psychologist deeply read in the classics, Sigmund Freud. Plato depicts human personality as a chariot pulled by two horses. One horse is upright and clean-limbed, white with black eyes, whose thirst for honor is tempered by restraint and modesty. He is a friend to genuine renown and needs no whip, but is driven simply by the word of command. The other horse is lumbering, crooked, and ill-made. Wantonness and boastfulness are his companions, and he is hardly controllable even with whip and goad. The first horse is the spirited soul. The second is the desiring soul. The charioteer is the rational soul, which should master the horses and drive them toward the good. Mastering the spirited soul is easy because it knows honor, and therefore something of virtue. Mastering the desiring soul is nearly impossible. The most strenuous efforts by reason are required to break it utterly. Plato's conception of the desiring soul reflects Greek disdain for slaves. Greeks said, are ignoble because they observe everything from the perspective of the stomach, quoted by Rahi. Even when the rational soul thinks it is master, desire springs up in dreams, said Plato. In dreams, a person doesn't stop at trying to have sex with his mother. He doesn't hold back from anything, however bizarre or disgusting. I've never wanted to have sex with my mother in a dream. Who thinks of that? That's sick. Ugh. As the Spartans feared rebellions and as the Spartans feared rebellion of the Helots, the rational soul of the guardians feared rebellion of the desiring soul. According to Plato, and unlike Socrates, bad behavior may stem from more than ignorance. It may stem from insufficient mastery of the rational over the spirited and desiring souls. Foolish pursuit of honor may lead to disasters, such as the charge of the Light Brigade. Even worse are the sins committed by giving in to the demands of the body. In the Phaedrus, Plato vividly describes the torments of a physical lover for a beautiful youth. Reason knows physical consummation of love is wrong, but the desire horse races headlong into it. Only by the strongest measures, yanking on the reins until the horse's mouth is drenched in blood and beating its haunches until they collapse to the ground, will the wicked horse abandon its lustful ways and submit to the commands of reason. Plato's analysis of human motivation contains, however, a profound muddle that haunted later philosophical and scientific psychology. In his explicitly psychological descriptions of human personality, reason was sharply differentiated from irrational passion. The desiring soul, and to a lesser extent the spirited soul, simply want, being incapable of any sort of rational thought at all. They are all drive and no reason, providing the energy that makes the chariot go. Reason is directive, steering the motivational souls to good ends. It is all reason and no drive, providing direction but not energy. However, when Plato described the souls operating in the citizens of his republic, the picture becomes more complicated. Citizens of the productive class are supposed to be dominated by desire, but they do not dash about in a confused orgy of lust and gratification. They are productive. Merchants must be able to calculate how to buy or make goods that people want, and how to price and market them. Tailors and shoemakers must be able to design clothes and shoes and properly execute the means to make them. Plato's disdain of the productive class reflects the disdain Athenian citizens felt for profit-seeking metics who preferred practical outcomes to the contemplation of truth. Similarly, auxiliaries must be able to make and carry out battle plans. Interesting. Interesting. So the ancient Greeks were like commie bros who hated people who made money, not because they wanted to make a better society for the slaves or the people that didn't have money. It's because they despised people that didn't, philosophize and meditate all day. At least these were the viewpoints of the thinkers. And we have to remember that the thinkers at this time were probably a very small minority. Most people were just, doing essential farming or slave whipping, whatever to do to get by in the day. But very interesting that Plato's view is that the thinkers are much better than the doers, right? This is what makes me think that Western civilization, once again, is a totally false concept, because people today unironically say, we've inherited the society from Aristotle, Plato, and Socrates. But Plato, Aristotle, and Socrates will look at American capitalism or European, commercialism as like totally ass backwards. So wait, you tell me that you vote, you let everybody vote, even women, every year? You give people a voice? You don't have slaves? You laud the worker? In fact, the democracy is built around the idea of how to raise the middle class. Like, this is not Western civilization as the Greeks thought about it. You know what I mean? So what is Western civilization? It's all BS. It does not exist. Sorry, I'm going to continue here. So, members of the productive and auxiliary classes clearly can calculate means to ends, suggesting that the desiring and spirited souls themselves have some measure of reason, being not mere engines of action. Reason, for its part, does not more than merely steer behavior. The souls of the guardians seek knowledge out of a special kind of eros, drawn not to physical bodies but by love of the good and beautiful themselves. Reason, then, is more than a calculator. It has a motive of its own, justice. Western thought from Plato's time to our own has wrestled with the relationship between reason on one hand and emotion and motivation on the other. Most classical and Hellenistic theorists favored Plato's official theory, distrusting emotion and subordinating it to reason. The Stoics aimed to completely extirpate the emotions and live by logic alone. On the other hand, followers of ecstatic Greek religions distrusted reason and found in strong emotion a pathway to the divine, as would the later Romantics, such as Keats. In the Age of Reason, David Hume spoke up for emotions, saying that reason is and can only be a slave to the passions or the emotions, capable of steering them but not initiating action on its own. Freud agreed with Hume, but modified Plato's image. With the Homeric warrior virtues lost by 1900, Freud described the rational ego as a rider struggling to master the horse of the id, Plato's desiring soul. Others, however, saw more in feeling than irrational desire. Shortly before Hume, Blaise Pascal wrote that the heart has its reasons that reason does not understand. Later, the Romantics revolted against cold reason, elevating feeling and intuition over scientific calculation. In our day, we worry about the triumph of the computer, the very model of Plato's charioteer, and about computer-inspired models of the mind, for which motives to do anything are missing. Today, psychologists are discovering that Pascal was right. Plato's chariot image contains another long-standing psychological issue called the homunculus problem. Homunculus means little man. Plato asks us to imagine that the driver of a person's behavior is the rational soul, a charioteer. He thus invites us to think of the rational soul as a little man inside the head, who steers the behavior of the body and manages the passions of the heart, belly, and genitals the way a charioteer steers the chariot and masters its horse. However, what accounts for the behavior of the little charioteer? Reason. Inside the head? Does he have inside an even smaller charioteer, an inner mini-me, who has, in turn, a still smaller charioteer, and so on, ad infinitum? To explain the behavior of a person by positing a small person inside is not adequate, because the actions of the inner person, the homunculus, remain unexplained, violating the iron law of explanation. To what extent Plato is guilty of this mistake is unclear, but it is a mistake that will crop up in psychology from Plato's day to our own. Conclusion: Plato's spiritual vision. Although Plato began with Socrates, he ultimately went a great deal further, constructing the first general point of view in philosophy. We must call it a point of view rather than a system because, unlike Aristotle, Plato did not work out a set of systematically interlocking theories across the whole range of human knowledge. For example, Plato's so-called theory of the forms is less a theory in epistemology than a vision, tempting to some people of a higher reality. The forms appear in different guises in different dialogues, and appear not at all in many. In the late dialogue, the Theaetetus, Plato discusses knowledge without mentioning the forms, and skeptically concludes that truth is elusive. The Platonic thought was more a point of view than a system made it easy for Christian thinkers to assimilate it during the early Middle Ages. Christians could pick and choose the most appealing parts of Plato and identify the realm of the forms with heaven. Plato's ideas resonate with other religions too. For example, the basic idea of the ladder of love, that one can move toward enlightenment beginning with physical love, is found in the Hindu path of kama, pleasure, and the Buddhist use of love imagery to lead the soul to the light of the one, although these ladders do not involve homosexuality. Many, if not most, world religions teach that in addition to this physical world, there is an invisible world of spirits. As with love, Brahmin Hindus and Buddhists teach that this world is an illusion, Maya, and that the soul must have as little to do with it as possible or risk more reincarnation. With Plato, they bid the charioteer of the body to discipline desire, but to go beyond metaphor to prescribe practices by which the desiring soul may be broken. In the Phaedrus, Plato talks metaphorically about controlling lust for one's beloved. Tantric yoga and Taoist masters provided concrete instructions on how to have sexual intercourse with perfect rational control while withholding orgasm to obtain spiritual strength. Tantrism, or personal health, Taoism. There is often an otherworldly, religious cast to Plato's thought because his philosophy was greatly influenced by changes taking place in Greek religion. Greek life was permeated by religion. Festivals and sacrifices to the gods were an everyday affair. Greek religion was the special arena of women, as politics and war were the special arenas of men. Greek beliefs and practices were pluralistic, but in the Polish tradition, that was on the way out, there was an emphasis on the radical separation of the human and divine worlds. The famous Greek epigram, "Know thyself," was not only an invitation to self-scrutiny, it was also an admonition to accept one's place in the universe, because the gods are divine and immortal and we are not. The Greeks valued self-control, making hubris, overweening pride, and pleonexia, greed, the most important sins in Greek eyes. The tendrils of a different kind of religion first appeared in movements such as Pythagoreanism and Orphism. These religions were mystical, teaching how to commune with the gods and teaching the existence of an immortal, reincarnating human soul. Following the stresses of the Peloponnesian War that lasted from 431 to 404 BC and the defeat of Athens, the Greek world experienced a religious revolution. New mystical cults and ecstatic practices replaced the polished tradition of seeking favors from the gods by making sacrifices to them. In these new rites, worshippers used music, wine, and erotic stimulation to achieve a divine madness, mania. The goal was to unite with the god they worshipped. Dionysus, for example, in a divine transcendental moment that would purge the initiate of her or his sins. These new religions also taught that each person was a divine, immortal soul. Plato accepted the new teachings, but sought to tame their excesses. He, too, taught that each person has an immortal soul, but that the path to salvation lay through philosophy, combining the new belief in a world beyond this one with the traditional Greek injunction to know thyself and exercise rational self-control. Plato's otherworldliness takes us to points on which Plato changed Socrates' teachings in ways Socrates himself might have found disturbing. Once he had his own philosophy to push, Plato discarded the penetrating search of the Alunchus for dialogues in which Socrates becomes a character on Plato's stage and his students become toadies, saying, "Oh yes, wise Socrates," and "it cannot be otherwise." Disdaining wealth and fame, Socrates was unworldly, but he was not otherworldly. Socrates never mentioned the forms, and he always meant a virtuous life to be worthwhile in this world, not some imagined afterlife, recalling imperial Athenians to the path of Sophocles. Socrates would converse with and try to teach virtue to anyone willing to undertake the Alunchus. Plato was an elitist, reserving academic education for an innately wise ruling class, the Guardians, and among them he reserved the study of philosophy only for the mature, over age 30, the age at which Spartans could leave their barracks, fearing it would make the young lawless. Plato's otherworldliness and search for eternal being had an important effect on the history of science. Recall that theoria meant contemplation. For Plato, contemplation of the forms, for Greeks, the highest form of knowledge. Plato and the Greeks generally disdained practical, useful knowledge, which they called metis, associated with the profit-seeking tradesmen who moved to Athens because of its wealth and were metics rather than citizens. For many centuries to come, philosophical thought in both Europe and Islam would be identified with demonstrable abstract knowledge rather than the active experimental inquiry into nature we associate with science today. Moreover, practical applications of science were rarely sought before the Enlightenment. As late as 1730, the British Patent Office rejected patents for devices that were labor-saving. In the Greek scheme of things, which Plato polished to high perfection, truth had little, if anything, to do with the world in which humans live. Life was something to escape, not embrace and improve. So, once again, a very different conception of science. I know some people say Western civilization is based on science and an idea for the progression of man, but the ancient Greeks, and very recently in the European mind, right, the idea that science was about measuring things, calculating things, was sort of the opposite. Like Plato's school of thought and Socrates' school of thought and the ancient Greeks thought the truth is not of this world. The truth is to be contemplated in the mind until we ascend beyond this world. So even though 1 plus 1 might equal 2, the truth is it equals 3. 1 plus 1 equals 3 is the truth in a hypothetical way. What a very interesting history. Whatever its faults, the Platonic vision has been immensely influential. The 20th century philosopher and mathematician Alfred North Whitehead said, "The safest general characterization of the whole Western philosophical tradition is that it consists of a series of footnotes to Plato." Returning a copy of the Republic to Ralph Waldo Emerson, a Vermont farmer said, "That book has a great number of my ideas." Plato had many students, but the most important was Aristotle, who nevertheless took philosophy in a more empirical and scientific way. Now we move on to Aristotle, the quest for nature. Like Plato, Aristotle came from a wealthy family, but from the remote province of Macedonia. His father was a physician to a Macedonian king, and Aristotle was a biologist as well as the first truly systematic philosopher. At 17, he went to the academy to study with Plato and remained there for 20 years. When Plato died, Aristotle left the academy and traveled around the Adriatic doing zoological research until being called by King Philip II of Macedon to be tutor to his son Alexander. Eventually, Aristotle returned to Athens and founded his own place of learning and research, the Lyceum. After Alexander the Great's death in 323 BCE, anti-Macedonian feeling prompted Aristotle to flee Athens, fearing that the Athenians might sin twice against philosophy. He died in the town of Chalcis soon after. I'm more than certain Chalcis is in Turkey. Somebody look it up. Somebody tell me where modern-day Chalcis is. I would bet $5. I'd bet $5 it's in Turkey. Anyway. The differences between Plato and Aristotle begin with temperament. Plato never developed a systematic philosophy, but wrote dramatic and provocative dialogues laying out a stirring cosmic vision, and there was clearly about him, as about so many Greek thinkers, something of the seer and shaman. Aristotle, on the other hand, was first and foremost a scientist, an empirically inclined observer of nature, as the rationalist Plato could never be. Whether writing about the soul or ethics, metaphysics or politics, dreams or art, Aristotle was always practical and down to earth. His surviving works are prose treatises, probably lecture notes. In them, we hear the voice of the first professor reviewing the literature. Fortunately for us, fortunately for us, else Fortunately for us, else we would know next to nothing about the pre-Socratics. So, before advancing his own carefully thought out and often reworked ideas. Even while philosophizing, Aristotle remained a scientist. We never find in Aristotle the otherworldly quasi-mysticism of Plato. Instead, Aristotle was always concerned with discovering what is natural, and until the term scientist was coined in the 19th century, people who studied nature were called natural philosophers. Unlike Plato, for whom what is most real exists in heavenly being rather than on earth, Aristotle, the biologist, looked to the world to define what is. Unlike the sophists who drew no sharp line between physis and nomos, believing that the human way of life should be built on what was best for human nature. Philosophy of science. Aristotle worked out a comprehensive philosophical system, including the first philosophy of science. As a working scientist who was also a philosopher, Aristotle painstakingly considered the goals and methods of science, defining in a large measure what science would be until the scientific revolution of the 17th century overthrew Aristotle to create the very different kind of science we know today. The four fashions of explanation. Aristotle set out four ways by which to explain things and events. Like Plato, Aristotle tended to focus on the former more than the latter, on understanding what a thing is, rather than on the dynamics of change, the focus of modern science. The most basic conceptual division for Aristotle was between form and matter. Aristotle's conception of matter was very different from ours. Today, we think of matter as coming in distinct types, with distinct properties, as in the elements in the atomic table, or the list of subatomic particles of quantum physics. However, for Aristotle, precisely because they can be distinguished and defined, such particles are already mixtures of intelligible form and rare matter, or raw matter. In this conception, matter was sheet, undifferentiated physical existence. The closest modern parallel to Aristotle's conception of matter is matter as it existed in the first seconds after the Big Bang, before the particles and elements had come into existence. Matter as such was unknowable, said Aristotle. For matter to be knowable, to be an object of perception in science, it has to be joined to form. Form is a term Aristotle took from Plato, but characteristically, he stripped it of its heavenly existence and demystified it. Hence, in Plato, it is form, in Aristotle, form, with a lowercase f. Form is, generally, what makes a thing that which it is, defining it and making it intelligible to us. The paradigm example of the relation of form and matter has always been a statue. Imagine a bronze statue of the type that stands on Momentum Avenue in Richmond, Virginia, representing a Confederate Civil War general such as Robert E. Lee or tennis champion Arthur Ashe. The matter of a statue is what it is made of. In the case of a Monument Avenue statue, it is bronze. When the bronze is cast, it takes on form, becoming a likeness of Lee or Ashe. The form makes the statue what it is. The same bronze could be cast as Lee or Ashe, same matter, different form. We can also have the same form in different matter. The figure of Lee or Ashe might be rendered in plaster clay or plastic. What makes something a statue of Robert E. Lee or Arthur Ashe is then its form, not its matter. And we know the statue through the form rather than the matter. In perception, Aristotle said, the mind receives the form of an object, but not its matter. Aristotle rejected what he called the separability of the forms. Plato's thesis that the forms exist in a realm of being separate from our imperfect physical world. Aristotle's general standpoint was that the alleged eternal forms do not explain anything. They are just glorified individuals. Perfect, heavenly individuals, true, but individuals nonetheless. There is no reason to think that if an artist cast 100 identical statues, there must be a separate 101st heavenly form of the statue that they all resemble. Similarly, there may be thousands of cats in the world, but there is no reason to think that there's an additional heavenly form of the cat too. Positing one perfect cat or statue does nothing to explain the nature of the physical cats or statues we see. We lose nothing by dropping the separate heavenly forms. Aristotle's concept of form, however, is more than just shape and is comprised of the other three causes. First, form defines what something is in its essence, the essential cause. The essential cause is definition. What defines a statue as being of Lee or ash is form, specifically form as its essential cause. Second, form includes how things come into existence or are made, the efficient cause. The efficient cause of a bronze statue is the process of casting the metal of a marble statue, the processing of chipping and polishing a block of marble into the desired shape. Third, form includes the purpose for which a thing exists, the final cause. Statues are erected to honor a great person and perpetuate his or her memory. Taking all things together, a thing's shape and essence, its process of creation, and its process of being constitutes a thing's form. Why it is what it is, independent of its physical embodiment, but not existing separately from it, as Plato held. Unlike Plato's form, Aristotle's form does not exist without being physically embodied in matter or some type. Although, as a scientist, Aristotle was more concerned with the physical world than Plato had been, his philosophy of science was unlike modern science in an important methodological respect. Aristotle observed nature and offered accounts of how nature works, but he did not interrogate nature through experimentation. For Aristotle, efficient causes were basically impositions of humans on nature. An acorn naturally grows into an oak tree, but without human builders, an oak will not become a house, nor bronze a statue. As a biologist by orientation, Aristotle wanted to understand how nature, untouched by human interference, naturally developed. He thus had an idea, or would have rejected the idea, of experimentation as fundamentally unnatural, distorting natural processes rather than revealing them. Today we think that to understand nature we must ask if questions via experiment, but that idea came late to science, as we will see in chapter 5. Aristotle continued in the Greek tradition of theoria, contemplation, disdaining practical knowledge in favor of developing abstract theories that demonstrated why the world is the way it is. Finding new and useful facts and techniques was never one of his goals. Aristotle's science is also very different from modern science with regard to his conception of causation. We think today of causation in terms of mechanisms, of how objects interact with one another by contact, by forces, or physical/chemical processes. But Aristotle thought of causes as the natural behavior of things given their essences. Thus, according to Aristotle, heavy objects fall simply because it is their inherent, essential nature to fall, not because of the interaction of two masses via the force of gravity. In sum, for Aristotle, efficient causes are unimportant to studying nature, being part of the human world of purposes and action. One of the most important innovations of the scientific revolution was to see the world as a machine driven entirely by mechanical causes, human caused or not. Modern science rejects Aristotle's idea that every event has a natural purpose behind it. As we will see in chapter 5 and 6, this change in the conception of the universe is being full as a this change in the conception of the universe as being full of purpose to being a simple machine will have profound implications for psychology and modern life. We will read one more section, potentiality and actuality, before we go on, before we call it a wrap today. So let's go right here. Potentiality and actuality. In Aristotle's philosophy, everything in the universe, with two exceptions, has both potentiality and actuality. A lump of bronze is actually a lump of bronze, but it is potentially a statue. A psychologist in Aristotle's sense, and his unmoved mover, whom Christians later identified with God. Sheer matter without form of any kind is pure potentiality, capable of becoming anything, as matter was at the moment of the Big Bang. If there is pure potentiality, Aristotle thought, there must logically be pure actuality, a being whose potentiality is used up, incapable of further change, perfected. This is the unmoved mover. Because it has no potentiality, the unmoved mover cannot change. Because the unmoved mover is perfect, fully actualized, other things naturally move toward it as their potentiality becomes actuality. This unmoved mover moves by being desired, not through activity of its own, the way a beloved moves a lover by inspiring desire, as in Plato's Ladder of Love. For Aristotle, love literally made the world go round. The more fully actualized a thing is, the nearer it is to the unmoved mover. The striving for actualization creates a grand hierarchy among all things, from perfectly unformed, neutral matter in a state of pure potentiality up to the unmoved mover. Aristotle called this hierarchy the neutral scale. Aristotle called this hierarchy the natural scale, but later it was called the great chain of being. The idea of potentiality and actuality may be regarded as a creative solution to an important biological problem that was not fully solved until the structure of DNA was elucidated in 1953. Plant an acorn and it becomes an oak. Plant a tomato seed and it becomes a tomato plant. Fertilize a human ovum and it becomes a human being. Unlike the casting of a bronze statue, these changes are examples of spontaneous development. We don't sculpt the acorn and its sprout to become an oak the way we mold bronze to become a statue. Moreover, biological development is directed to a predetermined end. Acorns never become tomato plants, tomato seeds never become oaks, and human mothers never give birth to bears. Such observations led the biologist Aristotle to see purpose everywhere in nature, including non-living things. Something apparently guides the acorn to naturally actualize its potential oakhood. Today we know what guides biological developments in DNA. For Aristotle, however, it was form. The purpose or final cause of an acorn is to become an oak. And so the striving of an acorn toward oakhood is an aspect of its form. Plato's forms were perfect objects in the realm of being. Aristotle's forms, at least in the biological world, are dynamic, directing development and constituting and controlling the life processes of living things. That was captivating. This was very interesting. I really enjoyed this read. Hopefully you enjoyed it too. We will be continuing with episode 7 of A History of Psychology from Antiquity to Modernity tomorrow. If you have any books that you think we should read, put them in the comments. We will try to get to them. I got a lot on the bookshelf I want to conquer for 2025 and 2026. As we near the new year coming, we will be continuing this series into the new year. Y'all be easy out there and peace.